My daughter called me senile in front of 2.3 million people. She posted a video claiming I wandered around Portland begging strangers for grocery money because I could no longer remember where I lived. By sunset, strangers were offering to buy me soup. By midnight, my bank had frozen one of my accounts for my protection. And 48 hours later, while my daughter was still crying on camera for donations, I signed paperwork selling my old apartment building for $3.45 million and filed a defamation lawsuit against her before lunch. Hello, hope you're doing all right today. I'll tell you this much. When grown children start using words like confused, frail, and for your own good, you'd better start checking what papers they're hiding behind their backs. And if you enjoy stories where people finally stop being polite punching bags, subscribe, like the video, and tell me in the comments, what would you do if your own child humiliated you online for money? I'm Miriam Alden. I'm 76 years old, and contrary to what my daughter Celia told the internet, I do not wander the streets begging for spare change. I own a 4-story apartment building called the Juniper House on Belmere Street, or at least I did at the beginning of this story. It's an old brick building from 1911 with crooked brass mailboxes, a cracked mosaic floor in the lobby, and a stubborn old Bakelite elevator button that only works if you press it with conviction. My late husband Arthur used to joke that the building had more personality than half our relatives. He wasn't wrong. The Juniper House smells faintly of radiator heat, old cedar polish, and sometimes garlic from apartment 3B, where Mr. Lazaro cooks puttanesca every Thursday like clockwork. The pipes rattle in winter, the windows sweat during storms, and every Christmas I still hang the same green velvet ribbon around the lobby banister myself because nobody else gets it symmetrical. Apparently, according to my daughter, that means I'm mentally incompetent. The video was posted on a Tuesday morning while I was eating rye toast with apricot preserves and trying to finish a crossword puzzle. I remember the clue vividly because irony has a cruel sense of humor. 8-letter word for betrayal. I never solved it. My phone started vibrating across the kitchen table around 8:12 a.m. Then again. Then again. By the 5th call, I thought somebody must have died. It was Vivian Tull from across the street. Miriam, she said carefully, in the same tone people use when approaching injured animals. Are you all right, honey? That irritated me immediately. I was all right until you used that voice on me. Silence. Then she sighed. You haven't seen it yet. Seen what? Another pause. Your daughter posted something online. I still remember how cold the kitchen suddenly felt. I opened Facebook first because that's where Celia liked performing her compassion. Birthdays, charity brunches, photos of expensive cheese boards nobody actually eats. Her profile picture was still the same professionally lit portrait where she tilted her head just enough to look sympathetic. The video had already crossed 2 million views. The thumbnail alone made my stomach turn. It showed me carrying grocery bags outside Juniper House wearing my old beige raincoat, the ugly one with the broken inner pocket. My shoulders looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Fragile, almost. Celia had added soft piano music over it. The caption read, My mother has been struggling with severe cognitive decline. She's too proud to admit she needs help. Yesterday, I found her asking neighbors for money because she forgot she had access to her own accounts. Please be kind. Elder mental health matters. There was a donation link underneath, a donation link. For me. I stared at the screen so long my tea went cold. The comments were worse. Your poor mother. You're such a good daughter. This breaks my heart. Can someone report this to Adult Protective Services? One woman wrote, My grandmother acted exactly like this before she forgot my name. Forgot her name. I still remember my 6th grade teacher's phone number from 1961. I clicked play. The video started with Celia, whispering dramatically into the camera outside my building. "I didn't know whether to post this," she said, already pretending to cry. But people need to understand how quickly dementia can happen. Then it cut to footage of me standing outside DeLuca's market. I remembered that moment perfectly. I hadn't been begging for money. I'd dropped my wallet between the car seats and borrowed $3 from Otto Bramley, one of my tenants, because I didn't feel like crawling under the steering wheel in the rain looking for it. Otto had laughed and called me stubborn. By evening, I'd already paid him back with cannoli. But in Celia's version, I looked confused and helpless. She zoomed in right when I squinted at my shopping list. "She doesn't even recognize familiar places anymore," Celia narrated softly. That part almost impressed me with its cruelty, because the familiar place she referred to was DeLuca's Market, a store I'd been shopping at since before she lost her baby teeth. My hand started shaking, not from age, but rage. Then the phone rang again. This time it was my bank. "Mrs. Alden," the young man said nervously, "we've received concerns regarding potential financial vulnerability." "I'm not vulnerable." "Of course, ma'am, but due to a report filed by an immediate family member." A report. My own daughter had filed a report against me. I stood up so abruptly, my chair scraped against the tile hard enough to startle the cat sleeping near the radiator. Outside my kitchen window, Portland Harbor was hidden under gray Atlantic fog. Somewhere down the street, a gull screamed over the fish market. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Except suddenly, I felt like the world had tilted half an inch sideways. The worst part wasn't embarrassment. It was realization. Because lies like this don't appear out of nowhere. They're prepared, edited, timed. And my daughter had timed this one carefully. I sat back down slowly and replayed the video from the beginning. This time, I paid attention to details instead of outrage. The camera angles, the edits, the dates. Some clips were weeks old. One was from outside Juniper House during the nor'easter in February. Another showed me fumbling with keys. Except I remembered exactly why. The front lock had frozen. She'd been collecting footage of me. Quietly. For how long? My stomach tightened. Then I noticed something else. In the background of one clip, barely visible on the kitchen counter behind Celia, sat a dark blue folder with a gold tab. I recognized it instantly. Estate planning. And that's when something cold settled into my chest. This wasn't just humiliation. This was preparation. By noon, 3 different people had asked me if I needed groceries delivered. One woman I barely remembered from church left a tote bag on my porch filled with canned soup, saltines, herbal tea, and something called brain support gummies that tasted like lavender-flavored chalk. Another neighbor slipped $20 into my mailbox inside a sympathy card that read, "You are not alone." I stood there on my porch, holding that card, while rain dripped from the awning onto my shoes. And for the first time in years, I genuinely didn't know whether to cry or throw something. I chose neither. Instead, I made coffee strong enough to strip varnish and sat at my kitchen table staring at the video again. The comments had doubled. Celia was replying to people now, of course, always gracious, always composed. "Thank you for caring about my mother. It's been heartbreaking. We're trying to get her proper help." We, interesting word, because until recently, we usually meant Celia and her husband Brock. And whenever Brock entered a conversation, money wasn't far behind. I should explain something about my daughter. Celia Raines had perfected the art of looking compassionate while calculating square footage in her head. At 48, she was elegant in the polished, expensive way. Magazine women are elegant. Cream-colored coats, white teeth, hair appointments that cost more than my first car payment. Even her sadness looked curated. When she hugged people, she always turned slightly toward the nearest camera. Arthur saw through her years before I did. "She's not cruel," he once told me while fixing a leak under the lobby sink at Juniper House. "But she's becoming the kind of person who thinks appearances matter more than truth. That's a dangerous thing." I defended her then. Mothers usually do. The truth is, Celia wasn't always like this. As a little girl, she used to sit in the Juniper House basement laundry room, reading mystery novels while I folded sheets. She loved orange creamsicles and old Fred Astaire movies. At 10 years old, she cried for 2 straight days when one of the tenants moved away. But somewhere between college and her second country club membership, embarrassment crept into her bloodstream like mold inside drywall. Suddenly, our building was run down. My cooking smelled too heavy. The people I loved became those renters. And me? I became useful mostly when paperwork was involved. The first time Brock asked about the building's value was during Thanksgiving 7 years ago. I remember because he asked while spooning bourbon glaze over sweet potatoes like he was discussing the weather. "You ever think of selling Juniper House, Miriam?" "No. Buildings that old become liabilities. So do some relatives." Arthur nearly choked, trying not to laugh. Brock smiled, but his eyes flattened for half a second. "Tiny thing. Easy to miss unless you were looking for it." After Arthur died, the questions got more frequent. "Have you updated your will? Who handles your accounts? What happens if you fall? What if someone manipulates you?" That last one still makes me laugh. Manipulates me. Meanwhile, Brock once tried convincing me to invest in a luxury pickleball complex outside Portsmouth. I'm not joking. 2 years ago, Celia started pushing harder. "Mom, you shouldn't be climbing those stairs." "Mom, managing tenants at your age is stressful." "Mom, wouldn't assisted living be easier?" Always framed gently, carefully, like wrapping barbed wire in silk ribbon. I kept saying no. Then came the folder. 3 weeks before the video appeared, Celia and Brock visited me on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Brock brought overpriced pastries from some Scandinavian bakery where cardamom buns cost $9 each. Celia wandered around my kitchen wiping imaginary dust from counters. At one point, Brock casually set a Navy folder on the table. "Just some emergency planning documents," he said. I didn't touch it immediately. Instead, I watched him. Brock had the habit of speaking too calmly when he wanted something. His voice became unnaturally smooth, like polished marble. "In case something happens unexpectedly," he continued, "medical authorization, temporary financial oversight, asset protection." "Sounds romantic," I said. Celia gave me that exhausted daughter smile she'd recently perfected online. "Mom, don't make everything into a fight." Fight. Funny word considering nobody had raised their voice except her. I finally opened the folder. Inside were forms for limited conservatorship. Not full control, not yet. Just enough to begin. I remember the exact sensation that passed through me then. Not fear, not shock. Recognition. Like finally seeing the shape of something lurking underwater. Brock kept talking. "We're just trying to make sure predators can't take advantage of you." Predators. At the time, I almost asked if he owned a mirror. but I stayed quiet. That's the thing people misunderstand about older women. They assume silence means weakness. Sometimes silence is reconnaissance. I flipped through the pages slowly while Celia pretended to admire my china cabinet. "Who suggested this?" I asked. "Our attorney." "Interesting." I turned another page. There it was. Property disposition review. Juniper House specifically listed by name. I looked up at Brock. "You've been very busy." He smiled too quickly. "Just being proactive." I closed the folder gently. Then I served coffee in my good porcelain cups while my daughter explained to me, the woman who'd balanced tenant ledgers since Reagan was president, why I might someday become incapable of understanding finances. I smiled through the entire conversation. And that terrified them more than anger would have, because by then I already knew something they didn't. Juniper House was quietly receiving offers. The first serious offer for Juniper House came 6 months before my daughter turned me into internet hospice content. Ironically, Celia almost spilled red wine on the paperwork the night it arrived. We'd been having dinner at her house. One of those modern gray homes where every surface looks expensive and uncomfortable. Nothing smelled cooked. Everything smelled scented. Vanilla candles, eucalyptus diffusers, polished stone countertops nobody actually used. Brock grilled salmon outside while talking loudly about market timing into his headset. Celia arranged olives on a marble tray like she was filming a lifestyle commercial. I brought dessert, a blackberry galette Arthur used to love. Nobody touched it. That should have told me everything. Halfway through dinner, my phone buzzed with an email from a woman named Priya Sandoval. I didn't recognize the name then. The subject line read, "Interest in historic multi-family property." Brock noticed immediately. "What's that?" "Business." He smiled. "You still calling Juniper House a business?" "Yes," I said. "That's generally what buildings with rent checks are called." Celia laughed too hard at that. I opened the email while they talked about Napa vacations and someone named Trish, who'd apparently spent $12,000 on a koi pond for emotional wellness. The offer surprised me. Not just because of the number, though that certainly got my attention. What surprised me was the tone. Priya wasn't some slick developer promising rooftop yoga and artisanal coffee kiosks. She worked for a preservation housing group that restored older buildings instead of gutting them. She specifically mentioned keeping long-term tenants protected. That mattered to me, maybe more than the money. I didn't answer the email immediately, but I remembered it, especially later, after the video. Because once somebody publicly questions your mental fitness, every financial decision becomes vulnerable. And suddenly, Brock's little folder looked a lot less theoretical. That afternoon, after the bank called me about financial concerns, I drove straight to Juniper House. Rain slicked the streets silver. Portland looked washed out and cold, the harbor hidden behind thick Atlantic fog. My windshield wipers squealed every few seconds because I keep forgetting to replace them. The building stood exactly where it always had on Belmere Street, stubborn as an old boxer. Red brick darkened by rain. Green awnings faded at the edges. Tiny chips in the stone staircase. Arthur always meant to repair himself. I sat in the car longer than necessary because I suddenly dreaded walking inside my own building. What if the tenants had seen the video? Of course they had. By then, half the city probably had. When I entered the lobby, Otto Bramley was watering the basil plants near the mailboxes. Otto is 79, wears suspenders year-round, and smells permanently like pipe tobacco, even though he quit smoking in 1998. He looked up. For one horrible second, I saw pity in his eyes, not judgment. Pity. That nearly hurt worse. "Miriam," he said carefully. There's that voice again. His face softened. You all right? I'm furious, which is medically excellent for circulation. That earned a laugh. Good. I needed normal laughter more than sympathy. Otto lowered the watering can. You know nobody here believes that nonsense, right? I looked at him. You'd be surprised what people believe when somebody cries on camera. He muttered something in Italian under his breath that definitely wasn't church approved. Then he handed me a folded printout. Someone had taped screenshots from Celia's video near the entrance earlier that morning. Otto had ripped them down before other tenants saw. One comment had been circled in blue ink. Her daughter should put her in a facility before she signs something dangerous. I stared at that sentence a long time, because there it was. The real fear. Not my health, not my memory, my signature. Otto watched my expression carefully. You think this is about the building? Yes. You gonna sell? Maybe. He nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer. You know, he said, Arthur once told me if anything ever happened to him, you'd outlast everybody. That nearly broke me. Not because it was sentimental. Because Arthur had been right. I rode the elevator up to the 4th floor afterward, listening to the cables groan the way they always do between floors 2 and 3. Apartment 4C was vacant now. I still had keys. Sometimes I went there just to think. The apartment overlooked the harbor if you leaned far enough toward the bay window. Arthur and I used to stand there during storms, drinking cheap sherry from tiny glasses we bought in Quebec sometime in the 80s. I sat there alone that afternoon replaying everything. The video, the folder, the bank call, the donations. And suddenly, pieces began fitting together too neatly to ignore. Celia didn't just want people thinking I was confused. She needed institutions to think it too. Banks, lawyers, maybe eventually a judge. I pulled out my phone and called Jonas Kettering. He answered on the 2nd ring. Miriam, I need to ask you something unpleasant. That usually means family. I think my daughter's trying to establish legal incompetence. Silence. Then his tone changed completely. What happened? Jonas Kettering had been my attorney for nearly 19 years, which meant he'd witnessed 3 plumbing lawsuits, 1 attempted bakery fire, 2 tenant divorces that somehow became my problem, and the unforgettable incident where a man tried paying 6 months of back rent with collectible ferret figurines. So when I told him, I thought my daughter was quietly building a case to declare me incompetent, he didn't laugh. He asked one question. What exactly did she do? I gave him everything. The video, the donation page, the report to the bank, the folder Brock brought to my kitchen, the comments implying I shouldn't be trusted to sign documents. Jonas stayed quiet long enough that I could hear him typing. Finally, he sighed. Miriam, this is bad. For her or me? That depends how fast we move. Rain tapped against the apartment windows. While he explained something I wish more elderly people understood. You do not need to be legally declared incompetent for your life to start collapsing. Sometimes all it takes is suspicion. One report to a bank. One concerned relative. One physician willing to write, possible cognitive decline, pending evaluation. Suddenly, transactions slow down. Access changes. Questions appear. Institutions become cautious. And cautious institutions can ruin a person faster than criminals sometimes. Especially if property is involved. Did you sign anything Brock gave you? Jonas asked. No. Good. Did they pressure you recently about selling Juniper House? I looked out toward the fog-covered harbor. Constantly. Another pause. Then Jonas asked quietly, "Has anyone formally approached you about buying the building?" "There's an offer." "How serious?" "Serious enough that Brock would probably develop chest pain if he heard the number." That got the smallest laugh out of him. "Don't discuss the sale with your family again," he said immediately. Not casually, not emotionally, nothing. Too late for that, unfortunately, because Brock already knew enough to smell money. A week before the video appeared, he'd shown up unannounced, carrying one of those absurd luxury coffees with cinnamon dusted into little leaf patterns on top. People only bring drinks like that when they want something expensive. We'd been standing in the Juniper House lobby while the radiator clanged like a steel drum band behind us. Brock glanced around at the building with poorly disguised impatience. "You know, this place could easily be converted into high-end units." "Belmere Street's changing. Buildings usually stay where you put them." He ignored that. "There's serious developer interest in this area." I watched him carefully over the rim of my coffee. "And how would you know?" That tiny hesitation again. "I hear things." Of course he did. Men like Brock always hear things right before trying to profit from them. Then he made the mistake that finally sharpened my instincts into certainty. He named a number. Honestly, in its condition, you'd probably be lucky getting 1.8. 1.8. I nearly smiled right there in the lobby, because Priya's preliminary estimate had already crossed 3 million, which meant one of two things was true. Either Brock was spectacularly uninformed, or he was intentionally trying to undervalue my building. Neither possibility made me eager to hand him conservatorship paperwork. Back in apartment 4C, Jonas continued laying out options. "First," he said, "you need an independent cognitive evaluation immediately." I nearly choked. "At my age, you have to take a memory exam because your daughter lies online?" "At your age," he corrected gently, "you document everything before somebody else does it for you." That irritated me because he was right. "I'll arrange it," he continued. "Second, I want screenshots of every post, every donation request, every comment implying incapacity." "I've already started." "Good." "Third," his voice hardened, "we close your building deal before they escalate." That word sat heavily in the room. Escalate. Because deep down, I already knew this wasn't finished. People don't publicly humiliate their mothers for sympathy unless they expect a payoff. And people definitely don't involve banks unless money is close. After hanging up with Jonas, I remained alone in apartment 4C while evening settled over Portland. The harbor lights blurred through mist beyond the windows. Somewhere downstairs, somebody was frying onions. The smell drifted faintly through the pipes. Normal life continuing beneath disaster. I walked slowly across the empty apartment. The hardwood creaked beneath my shoes. Arthur and I once considered moving into this unit ourselves after retirement. Better view, more sunlight, enough room for his ridiculous record collection and my antique secretary desk. Instead, life happened. Hospital bills, his heart attack, years disappearing quietly. I touched the old radiator near the window and suddenly remembered something Celia said 2 months earlier at brunch. We'd been at a trendy cafe where the menu listed toast like it was rare jewelry. Celia stirred oat milk into her coffee and said casually, "Honestly, Mom, sometimes I worry people could manipulate you financially." I'd laughed. At my age? Manipulation requires energy. I barely tolerate phone calls. But she didn't laugh. Instead, she exchanged one of those tiny glances with Brock. Married people develop a language made entirely from eye contact. At the time, I ignored it. Now I wished I hadn't. My phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. Praying for you. Delete. Then another. You raised such a kind daughter. That one almost made me throw the phone across the room. Instead, I slipped it into my purse and locked apartment 4C behind me. When I reached the lobby, Otto was still downstairs reading the newspaper beside the mailboxes. He looked up immediately. You got your war face on. My what? The face you had when that insurance company tried screwing Arthur after the flood in '96. I blinked. I'd forgotten about that. Otto folded his newspaper slowly. That usually means somebody's about to regret something. For the first time all day, I smiled. Let's hope so. The cognitive evaluation was scheduled for Thursday morning. Apparently, when your daughter tells the internet you're mentally deteriorating, you don't spend your week gardening or reading mystery novels anymore. You spend it proving you still know what year it is. There's a glamorous picture of aging for you. Jonas arranged the appointment through a physician named Dr. Elaine Mercer, someone with no connection to my family, which mattered now more than ever. According to Jonas, if Celia tried escalating things legally, an independent medical opinion would become critical. Critical. I hated that word. Everything suddenly sounded clinical and cold. Capacity, oversight, cognitive concerns, functional decline, as if I were turning into defective office equipment instead of a woman who still paid her own taxes. The morning after my call with Jonas, I woke before dawn. Rain hammered softly against the kitchen windows, while the old copper kettle hissed on the stove. I stood there in my robe, staring at Juniper House records spread across the table. Lease agreements, maintenance receipts, insurance renewals, handwritten notes Arthur left years ago in the margins. One of them simply read, "Don't trust men who wear expensive shoes during recessions." Still useful advice. My phone buzzed again. Celia. Mom, she said immediately, voice dripping concern thick enough to spread on toast. Why haven't you called me back? Because I was enjoying the silence. A pause. Then the carefully controlled sigh. Miriam, please don't do this. Interesting. Not mom, not mother. Miriam. People switch to your first name when they're preparing to treat you like paperwork. I saw the bank froze part of your account, she continued. That's exactly what I was worried about. You mean the problem you caused? I caused? Her tone sharpened instantly, before softening again. Mom, people are genuinely concerned. People or you? Another pause. In the background, I heard dishes clinking, and Brock's muffled voice saying something I couldn't quite catch. Celia lowered her voice. We need to talk in person. We already did. You filmed it. That's unfair. No. Unfair is telling millions of strangers your mother's losing her mind because she borrowed $3 from a tenant. She was worried about you, Brock suddenly inserted from somewhere nearby. Of course he was listening. Men like Brock always hover near money conversations the way gulls hover near fishing boats. I leaned back in my chair slowly. Brock, I said calmly, were you standing there the entire time? We're family, Miriam. That wasn't my question. Silence. Then Celia jumped back in quickly. Mom, nobody's attacking you. No? My bank seems pretty motivated. That's temporary. And the donations? That landed harder. For the first time, she sounded defensive instead of rehearsed. People wanted to help. You collected over $18,000. It's for care expenses. I don't require care expenses. You don't know what you'll require later. There it was. Not concern, positioning, future language, control language. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the harbor. Fog drifted low across Portland like torn wool. Somewhere below, a delivery truck rattled over potholes. You know what bothers me most? I asked quietly. Celia exhaled sharply. What? You never asked whether I was humiliated. She didn't answer, because humiliation was acceptable collateral damage to her. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear Brock muttering in the background again. Then Celia tried a different strategy. Mom, we're trying to protect you from making impulsive decisions. That sentence made my blood run cold. Not because of the words themselves, because she had no idea how much they revealed. Impulsive decisions, meaning financial ones, meaning Juniper House. I said nothing, and silence makes guilty people nervous. Celia rushed forward too quickly. Brock mentioned you've been speaking to buyers. There it was. Finally, I almost admired the patience. Weeks of videos, concern, phone calls, donations, subtle pressure. And eventually, the truth surfaced anyway. This had always been about the building. I speak to many people, I answered carefully. You shouldn't be handling negotiations alone. Why? Am I drooling on contracts now? Mom. No, let's be honest for once. My voice stayed calm, which unsettled her more than yelling ever could. You publicly implied I'm mentally compromised, I continued. You filed reports to my bank. Your husband brought conservatorship documents into my kitchen. And now suddenly you're worried I might sell property without supervision. Miriam, Brock interrupted smoothly. Nobody said supervision. You brought paperwork labeled oversight. Another silence. Then came the line that finally ended whatever remained of my patience. We're only trying to prevent someone from taking advantage of you, Celia whispered. I laughed. Actually laughed. A dry, tired laugh that startled even me. Sweetheart, I said softly, if somebody's trying to take advantage of me, they're calling from inside this conversation. Dead silence. Then the call disconnected, not ended politely. Disconnected. I stood there staring at my phone while my kettle shrieked behind me on the stove. A minute later, another call came through. Hazel. My granddaughter rarely phoned unexpectedly. I answered immediately. Grandma? Her voice sounded tight, nervous. Yes, honey. I think Mom's going too far. I closed my eyes slowly. Because when the children in a family start whispering truth instead of speaking it openly, something poisonous has already spread through the walls. What happened? I asked quietly. Hazel hesitated. Then she lowered her voice almost to a whisper. I overheard Dad and Brock arguing last night. About what? Another pause. Then she said the sentence that changed the shape of everything. They're scared you're going to sell Juniper House before they can stop you. Hazel arrived at my house, 40 minutes later, wearing an oversized brown sweatshirt, damp sneakers, and the expression of someone carrying information too heavy for her age. I opened the door before she could knock twice. You look freezing. I forgot my coat. You live in Maine. That's practically a felony. That earned the faintest smile, but it vanished quickly. I made tea while she sat at the kitchen table, twisting the sleeve around her wrist over and over again. Nervous habit. Celia used to do the same thing before piano recitals when she was little. Funny how anxiety survives generations, even when kindness doesn't. Outside, rain slid slowly down the windows. The kitchen smelled like bergamot tea and the lamb stew I'd left simmering too long. Somewhere near the harbor, a foghorn groaned through the afternoon. Hazel kept glancing toward my phone on the counter, like she expected it to explode. Finally, she whispered, "Grandma, are you really selling Juniper House?" I studied her carefully before answering. Yes. Her shoulders dropped, not in anger, relief. That caught me off guard. You're not upset? No. She shook her head quickly. Honestly, I think you should have sold it years ago if that's what you wanted. Wanted? Such a simple word. Strange how rarely anyone had asked me what I actually wanted lately. Everyone asked what was safest, smartest, most responsible. Nobody asked what I preferred. I carried 2 cups to the table and sat across from her. How much do you know? I asked quietly. Hazel hesitated. Then she pulled out her phone. A lot more than Mom thinks. She opened a screenshot first. A family group chat. Brock had written, "If she signs with another buyer before conservatorship review, we lose leverage completely." Below it, Celia replied, "She's getting more paranoid. The video helped establish concern publicly." My stomach turned cold. Not because I was shocked anymore. Because seeing manipulation written plainly removes the last comforting possibility of misunderstanding. Hazel looked miserable. "I shouldn't have read it," she murmured. Dad left his iPad open. "You absolutely should have read it." She looked up sharply. "I mean that," I said. "People doing ugly things rely on decent people looking away." Rain hammered harder against the windows. Hazel swallowed nervously. "There's more." Of course there was. She pulled up another screenshot. This one made my hands go still around the teacup. Brock had forwarded contact information for a developer named Halpern Urban Residential Group. Attached underneath, potential acquisition target, Juniper House. Elder owner, likely cooperative under family guidance. Family guidance. I almost laughed from sheer disbelief. Not owner representation, not legal management, family guidance. As if I were some confused widow wandering around clutching soup cans instead of a woman who'd managed 42 apartments through 3 recessions and 1 electrical fire. Hazel kept talking softly. "Mom thinks if they can prove you're declining cognitively, the court could delay any major sale decisions until they review things." There it was, finally spoken out loud. Not concern, delay, control, money. I leaned back slowly in my chair. For a moment, the kitchen felt unbearably quiet, except for the ticking wall clock Arthur bought in Vermont sometime around 1994. He'd insisted the uneven ticking sounded honest. Now it sounded like a countdown. Hazel stared at me anxiously. "Aren't you angry?" "Oh, sweetheart." I smiled without humor. I crossed angry somewhere around the donation link. That actually made her snort into her tea. Good. I needed one honest sound in the room. Then her face grew serious again. "There's something else." Of course there was. Mom and Brock were arguing after your bank froze the account. I folded my hands together calmly. About? Money? Hazel looked embarrassed saying it. "I guess Brock already promised some investor group they'd have influence over the building if you sold." There it was, the hidden panic. Not emotional betrayal. Financial exposure. Brock had already been negotiating around me, like vultures measuring curtains before the body's cold. Hazel lowered her voice further. "I heard him say if you closed with another buyer, They'd lose 7 figures in back-end participation. I blinked slowly. 7 figures. Jesus. No wonder they suddenly cared whether I remembered where I lived. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Hazel whispered, "Grandma, what are you going to do?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed violently across the counter. Celia, again, then immediately another call. Brock, then another. Unknown number. I stared at the screen while it vibrated itself in frantic little circles. Hazel looked pale. "You don't have to answer." "I know." The phone stopped. Then a text arrived from Celia. "Mom, we need to discuss your mental state before this gets out of control." I read it twice. Mental state. As if I were some unstable patient refusing medication. As if she hadn't created this entire nightmare herself. That's when something inside me became very, very calm. Not emotional calm, dangerous calm. The kind that arrives right before irreversible decisions. I stood slowly and walked toward the small secretary desk near the hallway. The same desk Arthur bought at an estate sale because he liked furniture with scars. Inside the bottom drawer sat my property files, insurance binders, sale drafts, tenant agreements, and Priya Sandoval's latest acquisition packet. I removed it carefully. Hazel watched me in silence. Then I placed the folder on the kitchen table between us. "I'm going to sell Juniper House," I said quietly, "before your mother gets the chance to turn me into a legal ghost." Hazel's eyes widened slightly. "And after that?" I looked toward the rain-covered windows, toward the harbor hidden somewhere beyond the fog, toward the life I suddenly realized I was fighting to keep. "After that," I said softly, "your mother's going to learn there's a very expensive difference between protecting someone and lying about them." Dr. Elaine Mercer's office smelled like lemon disinfectant and old books, which somehow made the entire experience feel even more humiliating. I arrived 15 minutes early because that's what competent adults do. Apparently now I had to document my punctuality like evidence in a murder trial. The receptionist smiled too brightly when I gave my name. "Oh yes, Mrs. Alden. Dr. Mercer will see you shortly for your cognitive assessment." Assessment. Wonderful. I sat in the waiting room beside a fake ficus tree and a table stacked with outdated sailing magazines while an elderly man across from me repeatedly fell asleep, holding a crossword puzzle upside down. And somehow, I was the one under review. I kept thinking about Celia while I waited. Not angrily anymore. That stage had passed. What unsettled me now was realization. The slow understanding that my daughter hadn't acted impulsively. She'd built a narrative carefully enough that complete strangers already believed it. That's the frightening thing about modern humiliation. Once it goes online, people don't ask whether it's true. They ask whether it feels true. And old women are easy targets. Wrinkled hands, slow steps, reading glasses. People see those things and immediately start imagining confusion. Dr. Mercer turned out to be a woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut sharply at the jawline and the direct eye contact of someone who doesn't tolerate nonsense. Good. I was in no mood for soft voices. She invited me into her office and closed the door gently. "I understand there are concerns regarding your cognitive health," she said. "There are concerns regarding my daughter's moral health," I corrected. One corner of her mouth twitched. Promising sign. The evaluation lasted nearly 2 hours. Memory recall, pattern recognition, financial reasoning. Questions about dates, current events, medications, decision-making. At one point, she asked me to calculate percentages faster than Brock probably could after 2 bourbons. At another, she slid a blank sheet of paper toward me. Please draw a clock reading 2:47. I stared at it. You know, I muttered, while drawing. When I was younger, adulthood looked very different than this. Dr. Mercer smiled faintly. Most people say that during these evaluations. Well, most people probably aren't being audited by their own children. That made her look up sharply from her notes. Interesting. Toward the end, she folded her hands together. Mrs. Alden, may I ask you something directly? Please. Do you personally feel incapable of managing your affairs? I nearly laughed. I own a 42-unit apartment building, negotiate commercial insurance contracts, and still file my own taxes without frightening accountants. The only thing I occasionally misplace is my reading glasses. She nodded slowly. Then she asked the question that mattered. Why do you think your family is raising these concerns? There it was, the ugly center of everything. I looked out her office window toward the gray Portland sky before answering. Because I'm old, I said quietly. And because old people become easier to reposition once someone convinces the world they're confused. Dr. Mercer didn't write anything for several seconds. Finally, she closed the file. Well, she said calmly, for what it's worth, you demonstrate no meaningful signs of cognitive impairment. I didn't realize how tightly my shoulders were locked until that moment. Some tension loosened instantly, not relief exactly. Vindication. There will be a formal report, she continued. Independent, thorough, legally defensible. Legally defensible. Beautiful phrase. I thanked her and stepped back into the rainy afternoon, feeling strangely lighter. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me not to. Mrs. Alden? A woman asked. Yes? My name is Mara Quinlan. I'm a journalist with the Portland Ledger. Of course. It had reached journalists now. I'm calling regarding your daughter's viral fundraising campaign. Campaign. Even reporters heard the word differently than family did. I'm not interested in interviews, I said immediately. I understand, Mara replied carefully. But before I publish anything, I wanted to ask whether you personally authorized those donations. I stopped walking. Rain tapped softly against my umbrella. No, I said. A pause. Then Mara spoke more carefully. Mrs. Alden, there may be larger questions developing around this story. I suddenly had the distinct feeling the internet's favorite compassionate daughter was about to have a very bad week. Mara Quinlan called me again the next morning at exactly 8:03. Journalists always call early when they think a story's about to explode. I was standing in my kitchen buttering burnt toast because my mind had wandered halfway through the toaster cycle. Rain hammered against the windows hard enough to blur the harbor completely, and the radiator hissed like an annoyed snake. Miriam, Mara said carefully, I need to ask you something off the record. That usually means I should be worried. Probably. I sat down slowly. Go ahead. There are inconsistencies in your daughter's fundraiser. That got my attention immediately. Mara lowered her voice. I could hear newsroom noise behind her. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, somebody laughing too loudly. The donation account isn't structured like a medical assistance fund, she explained. It routes through a private lifestyle nonprofit connected to your son-in-law. I blinked. Excuse me? The organization is called Heartbridge Family Advocacy Initiative. That sounded exactly like the kind of title rich people invent when they want tax benefits and applause simultaneously. Mara continued. Financially speaking, it gives them broad discretion over how the money's used. I stared at the untouched toast in my hand. So, strangers think they're helping an old woman with dementia. But legally, Mara finished carefully, the funds don't necessarily have to go directly toward your care. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because I was shocked anymore, because the greed had become so embarrassingly organized. First the video, then the donations, then the bank report, then conservatorship language, and now a nonprofit funnel. Arthur used to say some people don't steal with masks and guns anymore. They steal with mission statements. Miriam? Mara asked gently. Are you all right? No, I answered honestly, but I'm becoming extremely motivated. That earned the faintest laugh. Good. I liked her already. Before hanging up, Mara asked one final question. Have you formally denied cognitive impairment anywhere publicly? Only to my toaster. I'm serious. So am I. She exhaled patiently. Because if your daughter escalates this narrative, silence may eventually work against you. After the call ended, I poured fresh coffee and carried it into the small sitting room overlooking the street. Portland looked miserable that morning. Gray sidewalks, soaked brick, gulls fighting near overflowing trash bins. And yet, for the first time all week, I felt clarity. Not peace. Clarity. There's a difference. At 9:17 a.m., Hazel arrived carrying a canvas tote bag and enough nervous energy to power a lighthouse. I brought muffins, she announced breathlessly. You look like you're smuggling state secrets. That too. I nearly smiled. She sat beside me on the sofa and immediately pulled out her laptop. I found more. Of course she did. Hazel opened several screenshots from Brock's email. One included projected redevelopment renderings for Juniper House. Only it wasn't Juniper House anymore. The file label read, Belmere Luxury Residences. The images made my stomach twist. Gone were the green awnings Arthur picked himself. Gone were the brass mailboxes. Gone was the old lobby tile where generations of tenants tracked in snow every winter. In their place stood minimalist gray interiors that looked like expensive dentist offices, rooftop wine deck, executive wellness suite, private resident cigar lounge. I stared at the screen in disbelief. They already redesigned it, I whispered. Hazel nodded miserably. There's more. She opened another message thread. This one included Brock, some developer named Gavin Pike, and, unbelievably, Celia. Gavin wrote, Once competency review starts, she'll lose negotiation leverage quickly. Below it, Brock replied, Exactly. We just need enough delay to prevent outside closing. Outside closing, meaning Priya. Meaning they knew another buyer existed. Meaning this entire nightmare accelerated because they realized I might sell without them profiting first. Hazel looked sick. I'm sorry, Grandma. I closed the laptop gently. You have nothing to apologize for. They're my parents. She swallowed hard. I didn't know Mom could be like this. I looked toward the rain-covered windows. The truth was harder to say aloud. Yes, I answered quietly. You did. You just didn't want it to be true. That made tears fill her eyes instantly. I regretted the sharpness the moment it left my mouth, but sometimes honesty arrives wearing boots instead of slippers. Hazel wiped at her face quickly. What happens now? I stood and walked toward Arthur's old secretary desk again. Inside sat Priya Sandoval's acquisition packet, waiting patiently beneath 20 years of tax records and tenant files. I removed the folder carefully. Then I looked directly at my granddaughter. Now, I said calmly, We close the sale before your mother realizes she's already lost. Priya Sandoval did not work out of a glass tower downtown, like I expected. Her office occupied the upper floor of a converted theater near the waterfront, the old Marquette Cinema, closed sometime in the late 90s after multiplexes swallowed everything interesting in America. The lobby still smelled faintly of dust, espresso, and ancient velvet curtains. Faded gold stars decorated the ceiling above the reception desk, and somebody had preserved the original ticket booth for reasons I immediately respected. Places with history comfort me. Places trying too hard usually don't. Hazel came with me. Not because I needed emotional support, though perhaps I did, but because after everything she'd shown me, I no longer trusted my daughter's side of the family narrative to stay predictable. Priya greeted us personally. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s. Dark curls pinned loosely back, sharp navy blazer, silver fountain pen tucked behind one ear like she'd forgotten it there during battle. No fake sympathy. Good start. Mrs. Alden, she said warmly, shaking my hand. I'm glad you came in. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Hazel, then back to me. And you must be Hazel. That surprised us both. Priya smiled faintly. Your grandmother talks about you more kindly than she talks about most politicians and contractors. That narrowed the possibilities. Hazel actually laughed. Another good sign. We sat in a conference room overlooking the rainy harbor. Old movie posters still lined the walls. Casablanca, Roman Holiday, Rear Window. Arthur would have loved the place immediately. Priya opened a thick folder. I'll be direct, she said. We want Juniper House badly. Most people trying to buy something from me usually pretend not to. That wastes everyone's time. I liked her more by the minute. She spread architectural renderings across the table. Not luxury towers, not rooftop champagne lounges, restoration plans, original brick preservation, updated plumbing, protected long-term leases for older tenants. The lobby mosaic repaired instead of removed. Even the ridiculous bakelite elevator button was marked for restoration. I stared at the plans longer than I intended. You're keeping the mailboxes, I said quietly. Priya glanced down. Yes. Why? Because buildings remember things, she answered simply. And people stay longer in places that remember them back. That nearly broke my heart. Because Brock's developers saw Juniper House as coordinates. Priya saw it as a living thing. Hazel leaned forward slowly. So nobody gets forced out? Not under our proposal, Priya confirmed. Especially legacy tenants. Legacy tenants. Such a respectful phrase compared to Brock's favorite term, low-yield occupancy. I folded my hands carefully. There's something you should know, I said. My family may attempt to interfere with this sale. Priya didn't even blink. They already tried. That froze me completely. She opened another file and slid over a printed email chain. I recognized Brock's name instantly. 3 weeks earlier, he'd contacted Priya pretending to informally represent family interests. He questioned my mental sharpness, hinted I was becoming emotionally impulsive, and warned her I might become unable to execute rational sale decisions. The bastard. Hazel covered her mouth with one hand. He did this before the video, she whispered. Priya nodded calmly. That's when we became concerned. Concerned, not about me, about Brock. I read the final line twice. Family recommends delaying any binding agreements until competency matters are clarified. Competency matters. God, they really loved dressing greed in professional vocabulary. I leaned back slowly in my chair. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside, rain streaked across the harbor windows while fog rolled between cargo cranes like smoke from some exhausted machine. Finally, Priya spoke carefully. "Mrs. Alden, I need to ask something directly." "Go ahead." "Are you under any pressure from your family not to proceed?" I almost laughed. Pressure. Such a polite word for psychological mugging. "Yes," I answered simply. Hazel stared down at the table, ashamed on behalf of blood relatives she could no longer defend. Priya closed the file gently. "Then I recommend we accelerate closing immediately." That word again, accelerate. Everything suddenly moving faster now that the truth had surfaced. I looked at the restoration renderings one last time. Arthur's building surviving. Otto staying in his apartment. No rooftop cigar lounge for finance bros named Preston. Just dignity. Simple dignity. "How fast?" I asked. Priya exchanged a glance with her legal advisor. "If you sign today," she said carefully, "we can close within 48 hours. 48 hours. Exactly the amount of time it had taken my daughter to publicly destroy my reputation. Funny symmetry. I uncapped the pen slowly, then signed my name. The second video went online 12 hours after I signed the sale agreement. That timing wasn't accidental. Predators panic when prey stops standing still. I discovered the new video because Vivian Tull stormed into my kitchen without knocking, carrying 2 grocery bags and enough outrage to power a small city. "She's crying again," Vivian announced. "That narrows nothing down." Vivian slapped her phone onto the table. "There. Watch your little actress." I adjusted my glasses and pressed play. Celia sat in what looked like her living room, wrapped in a cream-colored sweater designed specifically to suggest emotional exhaustion. No heavy makeup this time. Softer lighting. Strategically red eyes. Professional grief. "I didn't want to make another update," she whispered shakily into the camera. "But things have become more serious than we realized." I nearly applauded the phrasing. Not emotional, legal, serious, calculated escalation. Celia dabbed beneath one eye with a tissue. "My mother is now surrounded by people who may be manipulating her financially. We believe she's being pressured into major property decisions she doesn't fully understand." There it was. Not subtle anymore. The comments exploded underneath in real time. "Protect her. This is elder abuse. Get emergency conservatorship now." One woman actually wrote, "Old people become dangerous to themselves when money is involved." Dangerous. Amazing how quickly society turns elderly women from invisible to threatening the moment assets appear. Vivian muttered something unrepeatable, involving witches and garden shears. Meanwhile, Celia continued speaking softly into the camera. "She's confused, angry, paranoid, and unfortunately, that's common in cognitive decline." Paranoid. Interesting word considering Brock had literally contacted buyers behind my back. Then came the part that made my stomach harden like stone. Celia lowered her voice dramatically. "We're especially worried because she's been speaking with outside investors without family supervision." Family supervision. I paused the video, slowly, carefully, then replayed just that sentence again. Hazel, sitting beside the window with her knees tucked beneath her, looked pale. "She actually said supervision." "She did." Vivian crossed her arms. "That girl doesn't want a mother. She wants a hostage with property taxes." I couldn't even argue anymore, because now the language was obvious. Not concern, authority, control, ownership. My phone buzzed violently. Jonas. I answered immediately. "You've seen it?" he asked. "Yes." "Good. Don't respond publicly yet." Tempting, though. "Miriam, listen carefully." His voice sharpened. "This crossed a legal threshold." That got my attention. "In what sense?" "She's no longer implying incapacity emotionally. She's publicly asserting impaired decision-making connected directly to active financial transactions." I leaned back slowly. Translation. Celia had just wandered into defamation territory wearing expensive boots. Jonas continued, "And if she files emergency review paperwork before closing, she won't." "You sound confident." "I already signed." Silence. Then Jonas exhaled sharply. "Well," he said carefully, "that certainly improves my mood." Hazel looked up instantly. "Wait, the sale's official?" "Pending final closing transfer," I answered. Vivian slapped the table happily. "Oh, that's delicious." I almost smiled. Almost. But underneath the satisfaction sat something heavier. Grief. Because no matter how ugly this became, I still remembered Celia at 7 years old, sleeping on my shoulder during thunderstorms. I remembered little rain boots by the front door, sticky popsicle fingers. School concerts. The first time she called me Mommy. People think betrayal erases love instantly. It doesn't. That's what makes it hurt. My phone buzzed again. This time Brock. Then immediately another unknown number. Then another. Hazel checked social media and inhaled sharply. "Grandma?" "What now?" "Your daughter's fundraiser passed $90,000. $90,000. Collected using my face, my age, my humiliation. I stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen window overlooking the harbor. Fog rolled heavily between the buildings while rain rattled against the glass. Somewhere out there, ordinary people believed they were helping a confused old woman survive. Meanwhile, that confused old woman had just sold a historic apartment building for $3.45 million without informing the daughter trying to legally sideline her. The irony almost tasted metallic. Then Hazel's phone buzzed. She looked down and went completely white. "What?" Her voice barely worked. "Mom just posted that she's meeting with attorneys tomorrow morning." The room went silent. Vivian muttered, "Oh, now we're cooking with gasoline." But oddly enough, I didn't feel panic anymore. Only certainty. Because by then, the paperwork was already moving faster than Celia understood. And in less than 24 hours, my daughter was going to discover something extremely unfortunate. You cannot declare a woman financially incompetent after she's already closed the deal. The final closing took place at 9:14 Friday morning inside a law office overlooking Commercial Street. No dramatic music, no shouting, no cinematic revenge speech, just signatures, wire confirmations, legal stamps, and one very expensive transfer that quietly changed my daughter's entire future without her knowing it yet. Funny how life works that way. People imagine power arriving loudly. Most real power arrives in silence. Jonas sat beside me, reviewing the last pages, while Priya's legal team finalized transfer authorization. The conference room smelled faintly of cedar polish and espresso. Outside the windows, Portland Harbor churned under steel-gray clouds, while ferries crawled through fog like exhausted ghosts. I signed the final page carefully. Miriam Elise Alden. Same signature I'd used for 43 years managing Juniper House. Same hand my daughter claimed couldn't be trusted anymore. The attorney across from me smiled politely. "Congratulations, Mrs. Alden." Just like that, it was done. $3,450,000. A portion transferred immediately into protected trusts for long-term tenants. Another into secured accounts Jonas helped structure beyond any future family intervention. The rest stayed exactly where I wanted it, under my control. Hazel squeezed my arm gently beneath the table. "You okay?" I surprised myself by answering honestly, "No." Because victory and grief sometimes share the same face. Juniper House had been my life, Arthur's life. 40 years of leaking pipes, tenant weddings, late rent excuses, Christmas wreaths, boiler disasters, and tiny human stories folded into brick walls. Selling it hurt, but losing control of my own identity would have hurt more. As we left the office, Jonas's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, then slowly smiled. "That," he said calmly, "is unfortunate timing for your daughter." I raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" "She filed preliminary emergency competency paperwork 42 minutes ago." Hazel actually gasped. Jonas slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Unfortunately for her," he continued, "the primary asset in question no longer belongs to you." For one long second, none of us spoke. Then Priya let out the smallest laugh. Cold, professional, almost admiring. "Well," she murmured, "that's going to ruin someone's afternoon." Mine improved considerably, not because I wanted Celia destroyed. Contrary to what people think, mothers rarely stop loving their children completely, even terrible ones. But there's a moment, usually late, painful, and unavoidable, when love finally stops meaning surrender. And I had reached mine. That evening, Celia hosted a fundraising gala downtown. Of course she did. Apparently humiliating your elderly mother online eventually leads to cocktail shrimp and donor walls. The event took place inside the East Point Maritime Hall, one of those renovated industrial venues with exposed brick, hanging Edison bulbs, and overpriced charcuterie arranged like museum exhibits. The fundraiser title nearly made me choke when Mara Quinlan texted it to me. Dignity for Elders Initiative. You really can't invent irony better than rich people. Let me tell you something, folks. If somebody publicly humiliates you while privately trying to control your money, don't scream first. Don't cry first. Gather documents. Gather proof. Quiet people with paperwork are a dangerous species. And honestly, if I were Miriam, I'd do exactly what she's about to do next. Mara had already secured entry through press credentials. Jonas insisted we attend. Publicly, he said, adjusting his tie. Your daughter built this narrative in front of an audience. Legally speaking, audiences matter. So there I was at 76 years old, wearing my dark navy wool coat and low heels, walking into my own public character assassination fundraiser beside my attorney and granddaughter. Life gets strange after retirement. Inside the hall, donors mingled beneath soft jazz while giant projection screens displayed black and white photos of elderly people looking tragically out windows. And there she was, Celia. Perfect posture, champagne-colored dress, one hand resting dramatically over her heart while speaking to guests about protecting vulnerable seniors. I watched silently from the back of the room while Brock circulated between investors, wearing the smug expression of a man who still thought he controlled the ending. Neither of them knew yet. Not about the completed sale, not about the failed leverage, not about the legal disaster already assembling around them. Hazel stood rigid beside me. I feel sick. That means your conscience works, I said softly. On stage, Celia tapped a champagne glass gently for attention. The room quieted. Then my daughter smiled sadly into the microphone and began speaking about me like I was already dead. My mother can no longer reliably distinguish between emotional attachment and financial reality. Celia said it softly, sadly, like a woman bravely carrying an impossible burden. A few people in the audience nodded sympathetically. One older man near the front even lowered his eyes like he was attending a memorial service instead of a fundraiser built on humiliation. I stood perfectly still near the back wall beside Jonas and Hazel, while giant projection screens displayed photographs of smiling seniors drinking tea beneath slogans about protection and dignity. Protection. That word again. Celia continued, speaking into the microphone with polished heartbreak. Families often wait too long to intervene because they're afraid of hurting someone they love. There's a strange thing that happens when betrayal becomes too obvious. You stop feeling shocked. You start noticing craftsmanship, the pauses, the voice tremors, the carefully timed sighs. She'd rehearsed this, probably in front of a mirror. Then came the sentence that finally pushed Jonas forward. My mother is currently being manipulated into financial decisions she doesn't fully understand. He looked at me once. I nodded, and together we walked toward the stage. At first, nobody reacted. People assumed I belonged there. Then, heads started turning one by one as recognition spread across the room like a match touching dry paper. Celia saw me halfway through her next sentence. Everything stopped. Not visibly at first, but I watched the exact moment her brain lost balance. Her smile froze. Her shoulders tightened. And for half a second, real fear finally appeared underneath all the performance. Mom? The microphone amplified it beautifully. The room went silent. Even the jazz music near the bar seemed to disappear. I kept walking calmly until I stood directly below the stage lights. Hazel remained behind me, pale but steady. Jonas carried a slim leather folder beneath one arm. Brock moved instantly through the crowd toward the stage, already sensing disaster. Miriam, he said sharply, forcing a smile. You shouldn't be here right now. Interesting choice of words. Not, how are you? Not, are you all right? You shouldn't be here. Like, I'd interrupted a business meeting. I looked up at my daughter. You've spoken about me publicly for 2 weeks, I said calmly. It seemed fair to finally let me attend. A nervous ripple moved through the audience. Mara Quinlan stood near the press table, already typing furiously into her phone. Good. Let somebody document this properly for once. Celia recovered quickly. I'll give her that. She lowered the microphone slightly and switched back to concerned daughter voice. Mom, I know this feels upsetting. No, I interrupted gently. What feels upsetting is watching my own child describe me like defective furniture. A few uncomfortable expressions appeared around the room, especially among the donors, because wealthy people love charity right up until it starts sounding ugly in person. Brock stepped closer. Miriam, maybe we should continue this privately. Jonas finally spoke. I strongly advise against that. Brock's face changed immediately. Recognition. Legal recognition. The kind people get when they suddenly realize paperwork has entered the room. Jonas handed him a sealed envelope. Formal notice of defamation action, he said calmly, as well as notification regarding fraudulent misrepresentation connected to public fundraising activities. The color drained from Brock's face so quickly, it almost looked painful. Celia stared at the envelope without touching it. "What is this?" "That," Jonas replied, "is the beginning of consequences." Murmurs exploded across the hall. Phones appeared instantly. People love recording disasters they don't understand. Celia's voice sharpened for the first time all evening. "This is ridiculous. She's confused and being manipulated." Poor choice of sentence. Especially then. Because Mara Quinlan stepped forward, holding printed documents. "Actually," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "independent medical evaluation states Mrs. Alden demonstrates no cognitive impairment whatsoever." Silence. Pure silence. Celia blinked once, twice, then looked toward Brock. Wrong move again, because guilty people always check each other before lying. Hazel stepped forward next. My granddaughter was trembling visibly, but her voice held. "I saw the messages, Mom." That landed harder than anything else so far. Celia went completely still. Hazel continued, tears filling her eyes now. "You and Brock were trying to delay the building sale. You talked about leverage and competency reviews before the videos even started." Several donors exchanged startled looks. One woman near the front slowly lowered her champagne glass. Brock tried stepping in immediately. "That's not what happened." Hazel looked directly at him. "I read the emails." And there it was. The fracture. Not legal, personal. Because public scandals are survivable. But children witnessing the truth? That leaves scars money can't smooth over. Celia finally descended from the stage toward me. For one brief second, she looked less like a polished socialite and more like the exhausted little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Then the expression vanished again. "You're humiliating me," she whispered. I stared at her quietly. And after everything she'd done, that sentence hurt the most. Because she still didn't understand. Humiliation wasn't what I was giving her. It was what she gave me first. The gala collapsed fast after that, not loudly, not dramatically, just the slow, ugly unraveling that happens when rich people realize a charity event may turn into evidence. Donors began whispering in tight little circles near the bar. One older couple quietly handed their untouched champagne glasses to a server and left without saying goodbye. Somebody near the stage muttered the word lawsuit, and suddenly everyone remembered they had somewhere else to be. Amazing how quickly compassion evaporates once liability enters the room. Celia stood frozen beside the podium, clutching the microphone too tightly. Brock had already switched into damage control mode. Jaw tight, smile gone, eyes calculating exits like a man trapped inside a burning investment portfolio. Meanwhile, Mara Quinlan moved through the crowd like a shark, scenting blood and seawater. Good journalist. Dangerous woman. I liked her immensely. "Miriam," Brock said carefully, lowering his voice, "you're making this much worse than it needs to be." I turned toward him slowly. "Worse than publicly telling millions of strangers I'm mentally incompetent?" "You know that's not what Celia meant." "Oh, then perhaps she accidentally collected $90,000 by mistake." That shut him up for exactly 3 seconds. Then Celia snapped, not loudly at first, just enough for the mask to crack. "You don't understand what this has done to us." Us. Still us. Still her. Not once had she asked what this did to me. Hazel flinched beside me, like she'd finally heard something she could never unhear. Celia took a shaky breath and stepped closer. "You embarrassed us for years with that building," she hissed quietly. "That place was falling apart, and you refused to let go." There it was. Finally, not concern, shame. The real engine underneath all of it. Juniper House embarrassed her. The old pipes, the tenants, the faded brick. Me. I looked at my daughter for a very long time before answering. "You know what your father loved most about that building?" Her expression tightened immediately at the mention of Arthur. "He said it made people feel less alone." For half a second, something flickered in her face. Guilt, maybe. Memory. Then Brock stepped in again too quickly. "We're drifting away from the real issue." "No," I said calmly. "We finally arrived at it." The hall had grown quieter now. People were pretending not to listen, while very obviously listening. One donor near the back was openly recording us with his phone. Classy species, wealthy philanthropists. Jonas remained beside me, silent and composed, which frightened Brock more than shouting ever could. Because calm attorneys mean preparation. Brock straightened his jacket. "Miriam, nobody wanted this public." I actually laughed at that. "You posted my face online with piano music." Even Mara snorted at that one. Celia's eyes suddenly filled with tears again, but this time they looked real. "I was scared," she whispered. And there it was. The first honest sentence all evening. Not scared for me, scared of losing control, scared of losing money, scared the building would leave the family before she could redirect it where she wanted. But fear nonetheless. I softened slightly, despite myself. That's the terrible thing about motherhood. Even after betrayal, part of you still searches for the child underneath the damage. "You could have talked to me," I said quietly. Celia shook her head instantly. "You never listened." "I listened plenty, I just said no." That hit harder than yelling would have. Because that was the real crime in her mind. I stopped obeying. Hazel stepped forward then, voice trembling. "Mom, you told people Grandma begged for money." Celia looked toward her daughter desperately. "I was trying to get attention on the situation." "You lied." Simple sentence. Small sentence. But it landed like a hammer. Brock moved immediately into legal language again. "Nobody lied. Certain details may have been emotionally interpreted." "Oh, stop!" Vivian Tull barked suddenly from somewhere behind us. I turned in shock. Vivian stood near the entrance, still wearing her raincoat and carrying the same enormous handbag she'd weaponized against rude people since 1987. Apparently, she'd come after seeing the live stream online. God bless elderly women with free evenings. "She borrowed $3 because she dropped her wallet," Vivian snapped loudly. "And she paid Otto back with cannoli the same day. You people turned it into dementia for internet donations." Several heads turned sharply toward Brock. The atmosphere changed instantly after that. Because details matter. Specific lies collapse faster than vague narratives. Celia looked around the room, finally understanding the tide had turned. Not legally, socially. And for people like her, social death feels very close to actual death. "Miriam," she whispered again, voice breaking now. "Please." I looked at my daughter standing beneath charity banners built from my humiliation. Then I answered with the calmest truth I had left. "You stopped being my protector the moment you started using my age like a weapon." Silence. Heavy. absolute. Somewhere near the bar, a glass shattered. Nobody even looked. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Celia looked genuinely small. The settlement negotiations began 3 days later. Not in a courtroom. Not under dramatic lighting with gasping spectators and television cameras. Just a polished conference room on the 7th floor of a downtown law office where the coffee tasted burnt and everybody suddenly spoke in careful legal sentences instead of emotional ones. Funny how fast outrage becomes professionalism once attorneys start billing by the hour. Celia arrived looking exhausted. Not socially exhausted. Truly exhausted. Her eyes were swollen beneath expensive concealer, and for the first time in years, she wasn't dressed like she expected to be photographed. No cream-colored perfection, no curated elegance. Just a dark coat, wrinkled blouse, and the posture of someone realizing consequences don't disappear because you start crying sincerely. Brock looked worse. Men like Brock age rapidly once money starts escaping their control. Jonas sat beside me reviewing documents while Priya joined remotely through video conference regarding the interference claims connected to Juniper House. The atmosphere felt less like family mediation and more like an autopsy. Appropriate, honestly. Celia's attorney cleared his throat first. My client is prepared to discuss a mutual resolution. Mutual. Interesting word considering one side publicly declared the other mentally incompetent for internet sympathy and financial leverage. Jonas didn't even blink. Your client falsely represented Mrs. Alden as cognitively impaired, he replied calmly. She interfered with active financial transactions, encouraged public misconceptions regarding legal competency, and participated in fundraising activities based on demonstrably false claims. The attorney nodded carefully. We understand the seriousness. No, I thought. You understand the exposure. Different thing entirely. Across the table, Celia stared at her folded hands. For once, she wasn't performing. No soft sighs. No trembling voice for an audience. Just silence. Hazel had refused to attend the meeting. Smart girl. Some damage shouldn't become spectator sport. Brock finally spoke. We never intended for things to escalate this far. I looked at him calmly. You filed competency paperwork 42 minutes after my building sale closed. That shut him up immediately. Jonas slid another document across the table. Additionally, he continued, we now have evidence Mr. Raines contacted outside developers attempting to influence perceived valuation and delay independent sale negotiations. The opposing attorney's face tightened. Ah. So Brock hadn't fully disclosed everything to his own legal team either. Excellent. Priya's voice came smoothly through the speakerphone. Our organization also considers Mr. Raines's communications professionally inappropriate and potentially actionable. Brock looked physically ill now. Good. Not because I enjoyed suffering, but because some people only recognize morality after it threatens their finances. The settlement itself became surprisingly straightforward after that. No admission of legal liability. Wealthy people cling to that phrase like life preservers. But the conditions were devastating enough. Celia would publicly retract all claims regarding cognitive impairment. The fundraiser would be shut down permanently. Every donation collected under my name would be refunded or redirected into verified elder housing assistance programs monitored independently. No family-controlled nonprofit involvement whatsoever. Additionally, a substantial financial settlement would be placed into a protected tenant support trust connected to former Juniper House residents. Poetic outcome, really. The building they tried turning into profit would now permanently fund the very kind of ordinary people Brock considered low-yield occupancy. Then came the hardest part. Not the legal discussion, the personal one. After attorneys stepped outside briefly to finalize language, Celia finally looked at me directly for the first time all morning. "I didn't think it would go this far," she whispered. I believed her. That's the tragedy. She thought she was managing perception, controlling narrative, applying pressure. People like Celia never think systems will turn around and swallow them too. "You told the world I was losing my mind," I said quietly. Tears filled her eyes instantly. "I was angry." "No," I corrected gently. "You were greedy." That landed harder. Because anger sounds human, greed sounds ugly, and ugly was exactly what this had become. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Then finally, "Do you hate me?" God. That question. At 76 years old, after everything she'd done, part of me still wanted to protect her from the answer. That's motherhood for you, nature's longest hostage negotiation. So I answered honestly. "No," I said softly. "I think that's why this hurt so much." Celia broke then. Not theatrically, not publicly. Just quiet crying into shaking hands while the conference room hummed softly with air conditioning and distant elevator bells. Brock stared straight ahead the entire time like a man watching his future dissolve in real estate terminology. And maybe he was. By the time the settlement finalized, several things had already happened outside that room. Mara Quinlan's article went live. Not sensationalized. That's what made it devastating. Careful timeline. Verified documents, independent medical findings, screenshots, fundraising inconsistencies, developer communications. The story spread fast because people recognized something ugly inside it. Not just greed, permission. The terrifying social permission people give themselves once an older person is labeled confused, especially an older woman. My mailbox filled for weeks afterward. Letters from widows, retired teachers, former nurses. One woman wrote that her son kept accidentally forgetting to return her bank card. Another said her daughter introduced her at parties as basically senile because she asked someone to repeat a question during dinner. So many quiet humiliations. So many women shrinking themselves to avoid being treated like burdens. I read every letter, every single one. And slowly, I realized this story had stopped belonging only to my family a long time ago. 3 months after the settlement, I bought a small cedar-shingled house near the water outside Camden. Nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms, a blue front door. An old iron bench facing the bay where gulls screamed at fishing boats every morning like tiny, angry supervisors. The kitchen smelled faintly of salt air and fresh paint, and for the first time in decades, every object inside belonged entirely to me. No tenants calling about clogged drains. No endless paperwork stacked beside my bed. No family members circling my finances like nervous investors. Just silence. Peaceful silence this time. I kept only a few things from Juniper House. Arthur's record player, my green depression glass mixing bowl, the brass mailbox plate from apartment 4C, and the old Bakelite elevator button Priya had mailed me after renovations started. She included a note. "Buildings remember people. This one remembered you kindly." I cried when I read that. Not dramatically, just quietly at my kitchen table with tea growing cold beside me, while Atlantic fog rolled across the windows. Hazel visited almost every Sunday. Sometimes we cooked together. Sometimes we walked the shoreline collecting smooth sea glass, while she told me stories about graduate school and terrible men with podcast opinions. Once she asked me something I'd been avoiding. "Do you think Mom's sorry?" I took a long time answering. The truth is, regret comes in different species. Some people regret hurting you. Others regret failing, and sometimes those look painfully similar. I think your mother's grieving the life she expected to have, I finally said. Hazel stared toward the harbor quietly. That's not the same thing, is it? No, I answered softly. It isn't. Celia and I spoke only twice after the settlement. The first conversation lasted 4 minutes and mostly involved lawyers. The second happened unexpectedly. I was buying pears at a small market near Rockport when I heard somebody say, "Mom?" I turned around slowly, and there she was. No makeup, no camera, just my daughter standing beside a basket of blood oranges, looking suddenly much younger and much older at the same time. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she spoke quietly. I almost didn't recognize you. I understood what she meant. I looked different now. Lighter somehow, not younger. Just no longer carrying the permanent tension of trying to earn affection from people already spending it elsewhere. Celia swallowed hard. I read the article comments, she admitted. That sounds unhealthy. A tiny laugh escaped her unexpectedly. Arthur's laugh. That nearly destroyed me. Then she looked down at the floor. People think I'm a monster. I considered lying. Mothers become fluent in comforting lies over time. But I was too old for dishonesty now. No, I said gently. People think you used fear to control someone who trusted you. Her eyes filled immediately. I never wanted to hurt you. I believe that too. That's the complicated part. Cruelty often begins as justification long before it becomes action. She thought she was fixing things, managing risk, protecting future stability. Somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a problem to organize. And once that happens, love becomes administrative. We stood there between stacks of fruit and jars of imported jam while strangers pushed shopping carts around us, completely unaware they were passing through the ruins of a family. Finally, Celia whispered, "Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at my daughter for a very long time. Then I answered with the only truth I had left. Forgiveness and trust are different things. She cried quietly after that, not loud enough to attract attention, just enough for me to remember the little girl who used to crawl into my lap after nightmares. I touched her hand once before leaving. That was all. Some relationships survive betrayal completely. Others survive only in smaller forms. A postcard instead of a house. A careful conversation instead of unconditional access. Maybe that's sad. Or maybe that's simply adulthood arriving late. These days, I wake early, make strong coffee, and sit by the bay watching weather roll over the water. Sometimes Hazel joins me. Sometimes Vivian visits and insults seagulls with shocking creativity. Sometimes I think about Arthur and the old building, and the life that existed before strangers online started discussing my decline like I wasn't alive to read it. And sometimes, though less often now, I think about how close I came to losing control of my own life simply because someone decided old age made me easier to rewrite. That's the dangerous thing nobody warns you about. People don't always steal money from elderly women. Sometimes they steal authority first. I'll say this plainly. If somebody humiliates you publicly while quietly trying to control your life, don't rush to scream. Gather receipts. Gather proof. Protect yourself before you defend yourself. And honestly, Miriam handled this better than most people half her age ever could. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments. Would you ever forgive Celia after everything she did, or would that door stay closed forever?